I will be discussing the most important yet overlooked text in the entire U.S. Constitution, the 14th Amendment. We interact with the states more than we do the national government, and the Bill of Rights and the amendments are a set of fluid and abstract ideas that the national government must follow. But what about our states? We're much more likely to interact with them for our safety, our education, and most importantly, to protect our natural rights. In one Supreme Court case, Barron versus Baltimore, the Supreme Court stripped away all the rights from all citizens in every state in the Union. They deemed that the national government was only beholden to the Bill of Rights and the amendments, not the states. So, in order to make sure that the states were protecting the rights of their citizens, the national government made the one amendment to rule them all. I love reading about Supreme Court cases because not only are they the determinants of what rights we now have, but they also let us understand what rights we have through the Constitution and what the Constitution really means. We get to interpret it. Because the Constitution, as you know, is not a very long document. You can fit it in a little pamphlet. So what does it all really mean? How do we understand it? And that's where Amendment 14 comes into play. Amendment 14 is different than every other amendment in the Constitution because it takes all the important civil liberties and rights from all the other amendments and incorporates them into our justice system and into all of our states, including the state of Florida. The state of Florida itself had one of these landmark incorporation cases called Gideon versus Wainwright. A man named Clarence Earl Gideon, who had ran away from home at a very young age and only had an 8th grade education, was denied a lawyer and had to represent himself in court. Whenever he was later found guilty, his government had abandoned him and thrown him to the wolves, and he still petitioned to the Florida Supreme Court and to the federal Supreme Court. He handwrote both of these petitions with only knowledge that he had learned while reading books in prison. He was a hero, but an unlikely hero. He only had a very menial education, but he was still able to pull himself up by his bootstraps and get all the way to the Supreme Court and get his case taken. He won that case, and he gave everyone the right to counsel for years and centuries to come. Now, another case that is concerning trial rights is Miranda versus Arizona, which you may have heard of because of the Miranda rights, the rights that the police read out to you whenever you're being arrested. I know there might be some of you who watch Law and Order every week, and you have the right to remain silent. Whatever you say or do can't be held against you in the court of law. And the important part of that is you have the right to an attorney. And you know what that regards to? Gideon versus Wainwright. So you can see all these cases kind of build on top of one another, and they create the pillars of law that we're all sitting or standing upon today. Miranda versus Arizona, even though it wasn't as benign a case, he wasn't an unlikely hero. He was found guilty after the Supreme Court case was over. But he allowed the people ahead of him to know what rights they had. Because self-incrimination is a real problem. I don't know if any of you in here have watched the documentary Making a Murderer, but this type of self-incrimination is very common. You gotta think about it. In most wrongful convictions, 1 in 4 of those wrongful convictions have some sort of self-incrimination that must be exonerated later by DNA evidence. So this is a big problem that Miranda versus Arizona seeks to correct. Another case regarding trial rights is Palco versus Connecticut, which established double jeopardy throughout the entirety of the states. This was another important aspect of the 14th Amendment of due process, and it shows that the 14th Amendment is so important because it makes these sweeping actions that go all across the United States. Nothing is like the 14th Amendment when it comes to putting our rights in action. Another case regarding the supremacy clause of the First Amendment and incorporating that is Engel versus Vitale. It outlawed a public school prayer in schooling, and it made more of a demand for private Christian schooling. This was later compounded upon with scientific education in later cases. Another case regarding natural rights and things of that nature is the incorporation of the Second Amendment. And that case was actually very recent. It was about 8 years ago when this was incorporated. And it was during the case McDonald versus the city of Chicago. Now, Otis McDonald, he was a 76-year-old retired maintenance engineer. And he wanted to own a handgun because his house had been broken into 5 times. Now, I don't know about you, but if my home had been broken into 5 times, I might have considered moving. But he had lived there all his life, and he was stubborn. He wanted to stay. This was his home, and he wasn't just going to give up. So he decided to form a group of Chicagoans with him and go challenge the city of Chicago's ban of handguns that had been in place since 1982. He brought this case all the way to the Supreme Court and managed to win the case and establish what the Second Amendment means today as we see it in the 21st century. They established that the right to defend oneself and one's property is essential to the Second Amendment and essential to the Bill of Rights itself. Now, another thing I would like to talk about is the 14th Amendment does more than just protect your individual rights. It also establishes the fact that if you are a citizen born in the nation, you are a citizen. It's called birthright citizenship. You may have heard of it. If an illegal immigrant family were to abandon their child in this country, we have the moral obligation to take care of her under the law. This also corrected the infamous 3/5 compromise, which was created at the beginning of the Constitution and made every former slave equal to 1 in Congress. Next, I want to talk about a thing called procedural due process that also comes out of the 14th Amendment, that law students take years to understand and master. This idea of procedural due process is very important as it delineates when the government can and cannot take away the rights of individuals when it regards matters of national security. We can look at the modern day at things like the Patriot Act, which came after 9/11 and the terrorist attacks, that balances that idea of a strong security but compromising the privacy of its citizens. This is very controversial, as you know, Edward Snowden and the NSA has been a big topic in everyone's mind for the past couple of decades. The Supreme Court is very important whenever it comes to all these incorporation clauses. And one of the most famous Supreme Court cases that came out of the 14th Amendment is Brown versus Board of Education. Brown versus Board of Education outlawed the separate but equal doctrine whenever it came to schools. And although it may not have been incorporated as quickly as some others, it allowed for blacks and whites to merge into the same school. Whenever it comes to the right to privacy with procedural due process, it's important that we recognize one of the most controversial Supreme Court cases in all of U.S. history, which is Roe versus Wade, a case most notable for the intense debate around abortion rights. Procedural due process can be made an argument for both sides of the coin. You have the pro-life argument, which is if the baby's the fetus's life is more important. And the other side of that is the medical privacy rights of the mother is more important. The idea of the 8th Amendment is also important because it establishes the right to marry. And whenever it comes to the Equal Protection Clause, the right to marry is important because it allows both straight couples to marry and gay couples to marry. And it decided the landmark case in 2013 that legalized gay marriage across the nation. So whether you agree with all of the extremely controversial cases that I've discussed today, there is no denying just how important the 14th Amendment is to our country. Whenever we look at all of these cases, we can make an entire U.S. politics, law, or history course out of just how much there is to process. Who knows what rights in the future that we will gain or will be protected because of the 14th Amendment. The tireless work of all these justices and the judicial system is what gives us our rights, and the 14th Amendment is the backbone to support it. So, for the polarizing past, the modern moment, and the foreseeable future, the 14th Amendment is our freedom realized. Thank you.